you may find that you want to go to Amazon to buy books by folks such as Dr. Scott de Hart, who I'm having on the show today as a guest to discuss his new book. So after the show here, if you find that you want to buy the book, just go to The Age of Transitions and click through the banner. And that will be helping me out. So thank you very much. My guest on Trans Resistor Radio today has been teaching for over 20 years, both at the university and high school level. He obtained his own PhD at the University of Oxford. He has a Doctor of Philosophy, and he is the author and co-author of many books. Prominent among them are books co-authored by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And most impressively, he is the father of 4 boys. I'm going to say I'm impressed by that. Today on the show, I welcome Dr. Scott Douglas de Hart.
Good morning, Aaron.
It's great to talk to you. Of course, today on the show, I've invited you to talk about your exciting new book, Shelley Unbound, Discovering Frankenstein's True Creator. So I'm looking forward to speaking about this. Before we get into the book, could we just get a little bit of your personal background? What sort of led you to become an author in the first place?
Well, I think my interest in writing goes back to my childhood, really. I was fortunate to have some good teachers throughout my school years, and also was raised by parents who were both college graduates and thinkers and artists. As a result, I think of the dinner table being the place of discussion for politics, history, English literature, you name it. It all took place around the kitchen table, and my father would press us for answers to things that we were learning, and then ask us to prove them. And really, the process of research and learning, and then turning that into writing, began at a very young age. But thankfully, was encouraged by some excellent who saw there was an ability to write and encouraged me.
Yeah, that's great. That's really what it's all about, is having that encouragement. And I think it's always, of course, it's always useful to be grateful of those of us who have had a good family background, to just take a moment and be grateful for that. So,
yeah, you're not kidding. It really, if I learned much from my parents, it was to pass that gift along to, as you said, my 4 sons. They got the same education, and most of it took place at the table.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Well, with Shelley Unbound, this book is gets into a range of subjects, all of which I'm personally fascinated with. We've got general topics are Frankenstein, alchemy, Illuminati, androgyny, and atheism.
Perhaps not the first thing one might see when reading Frankenstein the first time.
Exactly. So what is the main premise of the book? Could you just get into that?
Sure. The primary point behind the book was to really raise a question as to who wrote Frankenstein, which I know in most circles would seem like an obvious. It is Mary Shelley. Everybody knows it. The Grateful Dead even mentioned it in one of their songs. I mean, it's part of pop culture. There's no question who wrote Frankenstein. It was Mary Shelley. However, though that is how I was educated to approach the book, and every book and copy I had of Frankenstein had her name on the front of it, I never questioned it. However, much later as an adult, in rereading Frankenstein, particularly very thoroughly in research for another book that I had done with Dr. Farrell, Transhumanism, we decided that we wanted to try to integrate as much of the alchemistic and transhumanistic themes as we could. And so I began reaching back into some old literature that was still among my favorites, and I reapproached Frankenstein and grabbed the first edition, as I tend to do with most books. And as I began reading it, it became very clear to me, just at the preface level, that I was dealing with something that, for some reason, in all my previous readings had been lost, and that was the importance of the author's words in the preface. As I continued to read the preface, I became convinced very quickly that there was something about the book that had been missed by most who had been writing about it. Then I went to the second, more popular edition. Really, it's not the second, but the more popular later edition in 1831 of Frankenstein that has a new preface. And when I read the second preface, in other words, the one in 1831, I noticed that there were not only new elements added to the background of Frankenstein in this preface, but they were in complete contradiction to the preface in the very first edition of 1818. Well, as a researcher, that raised so many red flags for me that I didn't even look at the rest of the story at that time. All I did was focus on the issue of the background of the authors. When I began to do that, because Percy Shelley had also been a favorite of mine as a poet, I began to look at his life one more time, and the more research I did on the details of his background, the more it became obvious that the 1818 preface was his wording. Then, I had to compare it to the 1831, and at that moment, it became very clear that we were dealing with a cover-up. Why create a cover-up to a story which should be just a simple horror story, as Mary describes in the 1831 preface? She's writing a story to chill and to frighten the readers. She's writing something that is so horrible that it will make your heart stop. And I thought, has anybody ever read Frankenstein? There's nothing really horrific and frightening in the story. And the details are wrong. If the details of the history of the story written by the author are wrong, either she's lost her mind in the last 9 or 10 years since the first edition was written, or she is creating a story of her own in the history of it. And that became so obvious to me that the more that I began to look at the facts of it and to compare them, it became very clear that originally Frankenstein was written by somebody other than Mary Shelley, and the answer to it would be found in the details of the story and the details of the real author's life, which my book will argue there is a much stronger case to be made for the authorship of Frankenstein by Percy Shelley than Mary. So the book really makes the argument for any reader to reapproach Frankenstein and to consider it how differently it would be if read from the standpoint of Percy Shelley as the author. And I think it makes a very strong case to reopen that question in a very big way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we do give thought to the voice of any particular work that we're reading. So that's key important thing. But what are some of the other reasons that this topic, delving into how Percy Shelley is the more likely author of Frankenstein, why does that need to be discussed now, today, in our day?
Well, that's a good question. And again, that does go back to some of the research that Dr. Farrell and I were doing with transhumanism, which to some degree was to look at what is taking place within modern science and to see, is there a precedent and a history in the past for this stuff? And if so, what would be the goal to it? And Frankenstein obviously is really more of a story in science fiction, as well as, of course, I argue, autobiographically. But it is a story that's taking the science of his day and looking at ways to apply, one might argue, ancient alchemy, moving it into as modern of a science as they had at the time, and using it to structure a new world. And I think that the key to that is found in the placement of the story as the centerpiece, where the creature is made for Ingolstadt. So taking all of these themes together, back to your question, the reason it's important today is because the themes found in Frankenstein are incredibly relevant in today's world, where we are doing so many different experiments with whether it be humans or animals or food products. And is this intentionally to maybe rewire mankind? If so, rewire mankind for what? A new society, a godless society, a society without the basic things we take for granted in terms of what we would call human nature. And that, I think, is perhaps the most relevant question about reopening Frankenstein is, are there implications in the writing? Was there an agenda behind the story? And there certainly was. If approached from the authorship of Percy Shelley, the story has an agenda. If it's written from Mary, then we'll just take her word for it and say that it's nothing more than a very poorly written horror story without anything particularly frightening about it. It's more of a tragedy than it is a horror story. If that's how you want to read Frankenstein, okay, fine, you can. But I will argue very, very strongly that you're missing the real point of Frankenstein, because it has an agenda. It has an agenda of atheism. It has an agenda of revolution. It has an agenda of a new man for a new world. It has an agenda of alchemy and science. And it even has an agenda where one might argue the entire view of gender and this new world come together. It's a fascinating book if you, again, change the voice of the author. And it's very hard to read Frankenstein. I would say it's impossible. One has to be willfully blind in reading it to not see that those themes exist in it.
Yeah, and this is what really piques my interest, the alchemical, scientific goals leading up to present-day transhumanism. I find it fascinating, and just the possibility that such a relatively old work would be, in a sense, predictive programming for an agenda that's only really coming to the fore in today's world. Are you familiar with the concept of predictive programming, and do you think that that's what this book likely is?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because for years I've been teaching this novel in my classes, whether college or at the high school level. Most of my years, of course, were at the college level, about 2 decades. The last 5 to 10 years, perhaps, at the high school level. And about 3 years ago, talking about synchronicity and predictive, when I was teaching it, I began to move the themes of transhumanism and the agendas in it into my teaching, in a sense, kind of preloading that information to the students before they even began reading the story. And I began to find the work that you had done and use it in my classroom.
Oh, wow.
And I said, wow, this is really great. And so it was at that point that I actually became familiar with, obviously not you personally, before today. However, what you had put out and the research you had done worked its way into my teaching of Frankenstein, because the themes ran together so well. If we take those seriously, and I do, and clearly you do, and I can speak for Dr. Farrell as well, since I've worked with him quite a bit over the years, we would argue that some of the names and some of the agenda behind it, if you look at names like Paracelsus or Agrippa or Albertus Magnus, you're dealing with people who are not just meddling in the sciences or the alchemy of their day, but if you take it to the next step and you deal with the beginnings of things like Rosicrucianism, or even the works of Giordano Bruno, who I think is very significant, whose name actually ends up appearing in the picture of Dorian Gray, just dropped in as if out of nowhere and moved right past. You're looking at a group of men who were believing that there was a very ancient form of teaching, a very ancient, you might say, secret esoteric knowledge that had been handed down from generation to generation with the intention, both by its teaching and by passing it down, to create, very subversively and in a sense quietly, but to subvert the governments and the authority structures of the time. And the way to do this was both to teach it in a way that the average person would hear it, would work within them, and perhaps not be acknowledged, at least consciously, and then also a way to move your agenda forward with those who, as Shelley would call, were in the know, the cognoscenti, unitoi, as he uses the Latin terms, which are very particularly related to those kind of gnostic groups of people. So yes, I would agree that there is something in it, and virtually everything that Shelley wrote had an element to it which was meant to be both predictive and also to create the effect he wanted. And today, there's some disciplines such as neuro-linguistic programming that have taken this to another level of using the language, using the mind, in a sense, I'm not going to say controlling it, but influencing it to the degree that what feels like free will and free choice is really not so much free will and free choice as it is responding to a set of questions or opportunities and making the decision which has already been planted within. And that's really an undeniable thing if you do any studies in the work of the neurolinguistic programming community or those who have written on hypnotism or the effects of setting things into motion. Getting to the mind through words and through actions is very achievable. And clearly one of the best ways to do that is in writing or speaking, which has been the agenda and the process for many of these ancient fraternities.
Yeah. Well, there you go, ancient fraternities. We're talking about alchemy, we're talking about secret societies, quite obviously.
Well, let's also not leave out religion, for that matter, because I would argue that regardless of which religion one comes to, the monotheistic ones, but surely not those alone. Let's take the opening words of either the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the New Testament. Either way, in the beginning, God said. Or moving to John's Gospel, NRK and halagos. In the beginning was the Word. Mm-hmm. And you have the same idea that through what is spoken, with proper intention, there is an effect that is made. There is an act of creation that moves forward. These are the same words that one would have heard in the Middle Ages in Latin with incense and bells and bowings and prostrations, when the substance of bread and wine would be transubstantiated, and you would have something new, a new essence, a new nature that was now added or brought into the previous substance. So the idea of speaking, affecting a change, to, I guess, the average person, it sounds magical. To the religious or spiritual person, it sounds spiritual. And to the alchemists and to the scientists of the early days, they would have seen those things as very important parts of what takes place.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess as far as Frankenstein, the novel goes, it's anti-religion, really, if it's from Percy Shelley's standpoint, with him being an atheist, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that he was, in fact, inserting his own atheism into the story, and one could argue that that's putting it a little bit too far. However, he made it very clear in his own writings that he was going to attack the church. And he was going to do it in a way that most people would never see coming. And his intention was to hide his agenda. But that he would, in fact, strike that beast of what he saw as Christianity, and he would drive the dagger into its heart and put an end to it. This is an agenda that goes back very early with him, and one consistent with his earliest writings. His exact words, and quoting from him, writing a letter to one of his friends, he said, "I burn with impatience for the moment of Christianity's dissolution. It has injured me. I swear on the altar of perjured love to revenge myself on the hated cause of the effect, which even now I can scarcely help deploring. Indeed, I think it is to the benefit of society to destroy the opinions which can annihilate the dearest of its ties." And then he says, "I will stab the wretch in secret. Let us hope the wound which we inflict, though the dagger be concealed, will rankle in the heart of our adversary." That's not Percy being poetic. That is Percy being very honest to somebody who he could trust, and there were not many, obviously, because his words would have led him right into the death chambers.
Now, this the whole method of secrecy, the fact that somebody would write an entire novel and not take credit for it, I think this process baffles most people, and they don't understand why somebody would not want to take credit for something that they created. Can you just explain maybe the motivations for being secretive in this way?
Yeah, I think that's very important and a great question, because we're dealing with today. Our approach to literature is generally a bit maybe naive, and the idea that somebody would write something and then not claim credit for it is not very common today. However, in the time in which he was writing, it was a method which was used and continued to be used throughout in both religion and in government, where even the Protestant reformers, at times, not all of them, but there were some who felt the need to write under pseudonyms or anonymously, because they knew the agenda that they were trying to affect could not be done with their name attached to it, because they would be put with wanted posters all over town. And whenever they would travel, and Giordano Bruno is a good example of this, they would be picked up, turned in, brought to trial, and then executed publicly. Shelley, from a very young age, used the idea of anonymity and concealment to his credit. And what I mean is to get what he wanted, whether it was a date with a young girl in town, or whether it was to publish, let's say, a little bit of poetry which was either risque or provocative. From the earliest writings, including his very first set of poems that he published with his sister, oddly enough, who was named Elizabeth, he began using pseudonyms. And in fact, the first one he used, again, oddly enough, was Victor. And his intention in publishing without his name was to say things which publicly should not be said. Now, this goes back to his original poetry. The next work he does is a novel called Zastrozzi, which deals with questions of the Philosopher's Stone. And he moves on to another novel afterwards, St. Irvine, which he writes as, quote-unquote, a gentleman of the University of Oxford, as though he's really hiding himself. And St. Irvine, or the Rosicrucian, is a novel, a short novel, but deals specifically with the questions of death, pacts with the devil, the afterlife, chasing, mountain scenes, and torture. He moves it next into a work that got him the left foot of fellowship from the University of Oxford, his little tract, The Necessity of Atheism. followed by letters that he wrote to the clergy in the Church of England, trying to convince them that he was a priest struggling with his own faith, and he had just read a brilliant tract called The Necessity of Atheism, which of course he himself had written, and asking them to help him to regain his faith. Well, he did it not just as a game, though it was to a certain degree. He was a bit of a child, I think, deep in his heart, and he liked the idea of playing with people. But what he was really doing was building his own research as to how to address the other side of an argument. And he used other people while writing under a false name or anonymously to get his message out. He would put it in hot air balloons. He would put it in bottles and send them out to sea. He would hand deliver them using false. His entire method was to hide his real identity, write material which would be seditious and criminal, and spread it out. Well, the moment you begin doing that, obviously you've put your life in danger, because at that time period they are still executing people who are writing against the king, against the church, and material which just simply was not suitable for public reading, as they thought, because of its danger. And not taking it too far, but remember that at the time period he's writing, we are talking about a period that is hinging on recent events, including the founding of the Illuminati and the influence of the Illuminati in the overturning of governments in what would have been the colonies over here, or in France, and it's working its way through England. So this is not just hey, we're talking about Beyonce and this nonsense today. We're talking about a period when, in fact, there were some very deep intellectual origins to revolutions, and the people who wrote, and since we already mentioned the Illuminati, Adam Weishaupt, who was a professor at all places at the University of Ingolstadt, is the key founder of the Bavarian Illuminati, whose agenda was written out, kept anonymous, transferred to its members, who all took false names, and who used literature, particularly, to spread their ideas. Percy Shelley is not just simply on the outside of that, though he never became a member of the Bavarian Illuminati from anything I have found. He clearly was aware of it and its agenda, and wrote to his own publisher talking about using their methods to affect the same thing. I think he probably did not seek to join if he had ever been asked, just simply because he was a bit of a lone ranger sort. He saw himself as not needing to work with a group of people, safer to work alone, but he did have enough confidence in his own education, experience, and abilities to do the same thing in his own way. And that's what he was after. And he made it very clear, explicitly clear to his publisher, that their methods were the ones he would adopt. And I already read the quotation about his intention to destroy Christianity, and to do it in a way that nobody would see. The dagger would be concealed, but it would go deep into the heart of the church. And when you look at Frankenstein from both an overview, clearly the absence of God is one of the first things that comes up. But at a more close inspection of the story, you do see that the church comes off quite a bit as a villain in the story. And that's a very subtle way for, I think, a highly educated person to slide their agenda in. If you put it too upfront, as he did in the Necessity of Atheism, too many people are going to be immediately offended and never read what you're writing. If you can conceal it, what your agenda is, and yet turn the mind of the people against your enemy, or the one you want them to perceive as an enemy, you can achieve it. And in Frankenstein, the creature is clearly not the enemy of the story. He's more of a sympathetic figure of it. But one of the, I think, the most glaring examples is when Justine, the household servant, is made to confess to a crime which she did not commit because of pressure put upon her by her confessor priest. And as a result, she ends up, of course, being executed for a lie. And she makes the lie in order to secure her place in heaven. In other words, she has to disavow her own sense of integrity and honesty to gain heaven, which seems quite reversed, doesn't it? I will lie so that God will forgive me. And that's exactly what she does under pressure from the church. And it is also a bit veiled, but again brought in the de Lacy household, where the family is turned against because of differences over religious belief between what would be Christianity and Islam. So it does subtly work its way into the story, and it hits the reader at an emotional level without really contemplating too deeply why you feel emotionally bothered by what's taken place. And the fact that the creature who's made without the hand of God is sympathetic, and the people who believe in God come off as the ones who are really villainous. I'll tell you what, as a writer, that's a nice trick to be able to pull off, and Percy was no slouch, and that type of agenda is fit very closely with what his own views were.
Yeah. Well, this is just the process of writing in such a way I feel is important in order that maybe we could find similar examples in contemporary fiction. Do you think that this sort of veiled authorship, if not secret and subversive messages, exist within literature and media today?
I think so. I think we have to take that very seriously. We would like to think that we live in a society where one can just come straight out and say what they want to say. And to a small degree, less and less, I think, each day.
Yeah, I hear you.
Here we are recording this, but less and less today can we say exactly what we want without the fear of being labeled some type of an enemy combatant, right? We do want to say that we have a degree of freedom of speech and thought, but when your agenda is one that could be taken as offensive or atheistic, people still have a guttural reaction to it. And so how would you try to communicate those things? Well, incrementally dropping it in and just kind of slowly, gradually acclimating the public to your ideas as of being of greater benefit to society. And I think, and you've done, I think, a great amount of work and brilliant work on the idea of transhumanism. This is an agenda which has been at work for a very long time, going back in recent times, more recent times, modern times, to the idea of eugenics and kind of creating the community and society you want by the process of changing or eliminating the ones who don't get with your program. And there is that forceful, kind of gloved fist that in the back of our minds we wonder just how far we can go and disagree with the agenda being brought up against us. And what is the penalty one pays for disagreeing too much? There are things that are just simply not prudent to say publicly. Mm-hmm. And so how would we do it? I don't mean that I'm doing it, because I'm not. I'm more on the side of trying to expose it, and my writings have my names on them. But I will tell you, there are more than a few that Dr. Farrell and I have sat down to write, and transhumanism was one of those examples, where all that we thought we could say, we stepped back and said, it's not exactly prudent to say that. We're going to leave it out. We didn't try to hide it. We just simply left it out. Mm-hmm. And the amount of pages and words that did not make their way into transhumanism or any other number of my books or his was done intentionally because we felt either, number one, people would not understand it yet, or number two, it was something that would set off alarm bells with too many people that we really didn't want to show up on a radar as we have an agenda. Our agenda, if anything, we put very straightforwardly in the books, which is really to just provoke people to think, and at the level of thinking, ask, where would this lead? Which, again, in credit to you and, as I said, to your work, which I've used in my own classroom, you do the same thing quite well by saying, here are the things that are being done, here are the people who are saying them, and should we be concerned? And you ask those rhetorical questions throughout your work, because those rhetorical questions are the things we want to ask. We don't want to tell people how to think. We want to tell them to think. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's doing work in the media, we want to get the ideas out there, but we also have to be very careful that we're not perceived as trying to form people into a new model after us, but really to just say, are you aware there are things taking place, sealed or veiled or sold to you as a great benefit to society, which you need to be very careful about. And today's writers and people in the media, some use it to, I think, create their agenda and to create and mold a group of people or a society that is adaptable to it. And clearly anybody who's more than 30 years old who's lived in this country can see the vast changes that have taken place and how subtly it has been worked into the media and in the writing around us. And perhaps, Hollywood can take a little bit of credit for that as well, but I think it's the less obvious areas where we have to be more concerned.
Yeah. I think I know what you're hinting at, and certain things that aren't prudent to talk about, things like that. I'm right there with you. I know what you mean. Back to Shelley, and I guess the Shelleys, really. We'll talk about Percy and Mary, because in light of this idea that Percy is the author of Frankenstein, some actual elements of their personal relationship kind of come up, I think. I know that Shelley was always searching for his soulmate, and then you've got Mary Shelley. I'm wondering if Mary Shelley, in perpetuating a lie in that she's the actual author of Frankenstein, that perhaps she is becoming... Let's see here. You've got Mary. The name Mary sort of connects to the Virgin Mary, yes, and the feminine principle being kind of connected to the soul. Perhaps her act of perpetuating this authorship lie was her way of becoming more of Percy's soulmate in the spiritual sense, attaching herself to his spiritual work, than she ever could have been in their literal, mundane marital relationship.
Well, that is an excellent insight, Aaron. It's really an excellent insight. I think you're exactly right. This is a woman who, after, let's say, the idea that she wrote Frankenstein, who never wrote anything which is remotely comparable to Frankenstein. This was one of the key points that some of the reviewers began to notice shortly after she began writing her novels after Frankenstein, and pointed out the inferiority of the work afterwards. She aligned herself rather intentionally, and I don't mean to put Mary off as somebody who is scandalous here. Are you there?
Yeah. I'm
okay.
There. Yeah, sorry about
that. But taking Mary for who she is, and having read the book, my point of view on her is that she comes off as a hero. I in no way am throwing stones at her for this. I believe she did take credit for it when he pushed it at her as an act of love. And the idea of their personalities is a key element on that, which you just picked up. When she meets him, he is already married. He does have children. And I'm not going to say was a philanderer, because that gives the idea that he was doing these things behind other people's backs, when in fact he was very upfront about his idea of free love during that time, as was William Godwin, Mary's father, as was her mother, also named Mary, who died in childbirth with her, of course, which the more feminist interpretations of Frankenstein would argue this is really her agenda, is to deal with the loss of her mother. Of course, she's not the only one who lost a relationship with her mother, as Shelley Unbound points out. But she never had that full attachment to him because, number one, he was not a believer in marriage, and secondly, he did have, as you said, a very deep philosophical point of view that Plato brings out in his work, The Banquet or the Symposium, in which Aristophanes explains the origin of love and explains it from the standpoint that humans were at one point androgynous and unified, male-female or male-male or female-female people, and that at a certain point in time they grew in their ideas of how they would be more like God, and their knowledge increased and their power increased, and as a result Jupiter splits them in half and divides them to weaken them, and from that point you have male-female or male-male, female-female relationships or soulmates, the idea to return back to a sense of wholeness, and that other person that one is seeking after their entire life, their quote-unquote soulmate, has a very ancient origin. This is not kind of a modern Hallmark idea, though it obviously gets sold a bit that way today. But philosophy presents this very clearly in Plato's ideas, and Frankenstein, when you look at it again through the authorship of someone like Percy Shelley, makes a great deal more sense, because as Frankenstein is being finished, he is translating for his own benefit and no one else's a work on translating Plato's Symposium. This idea is the key point in the Symposium. And Frankenstein is a story about, take the main characters, Walden, who is seeking after an undiscovered land, meanwhile leaving behind all the relationships that he has because he's tormented by this quest that is unfulfilled. You have Frankenstein himself, Victor, who is attached, in a sense, to his cousin, which is rather interesting, his sister cousin, but tends to avoid the deeper relationship with her that seems to be there because he has this other quest that is more important, which, of course, ends up horrifying him. You have the creature who is really after one thing, which is to find love reciprocated back to it or him, which, of course, is frustrated by the destruction of his, to-be female companion. When Victor destroys it, saying, if this guy is horrible, imagine what his mate could be. She could be twice as bad as him, which is an interesting point of view as well that I just won't even touch that one. However, we are dealing with a story where the primary characters, and we could even slide Elizabeth, Victor's fiancée, later bride, into the story. She is frustrated because she really doesn't have that relationship as well, because Victor's always running from her. And everyone else either loses their parent or their wife in the story, whether it be the orphaned child Elizabeth, or whether it be Elizabeth, who is later, of course, killed off in the story, or Clerval, who is killed off in the story, who is Victor's closest friend. The idea of wanting and desiring that relationship that is so elusive drives everybody to these extremes, including Victor's mother, who, of course, dies as a result of a disease she picks up taking care of her household. So it is a story are disappointed time after time after time, but this sends them on their own particular quests, one might say, one which never turns out for any of them.
Yeah, now, I was just... You mentioned how Frankenstein, as credited to Mary Shelley, is often used as an example of a kind of feminist masterpiece. And this is definitely a rhetorical question, but do you think that this might actually be in line with Percy Shelley's intent, with as him as the actual author, to it become a feminist piece?
Another excellent question. I've contemplated that as well myself, because he was enamored with not just the writings of William Godwin, who was like him, a believer in free love, and an atheist, and formerly a believer. But you're also looking at the possibility that because of Percy's affection and his admiration for the writings of Mary's mother, who was a renowned feminist, Vindication of the Rights of Women, written by Mary Wollstonecraft. Percy is, I think, drawn into that family because of the belief that you have here finally this is going to come off the wrong way, but you have, in a sense, a masculine or a woman displaying some very strong masculine traits. Somebody who comes from a family of people with great minds and with a certain inner strength, which was something he was always looking for in the women around him. Women who were feminine, we'd say, on the outside, but had a very strong masculine sort of spirit on the inside. And in creating a story such as this and passing it off to Mary, would he feel that he has somehow vindicated the need to show a gender equality? I think by passing it to her, yes, you may be 100% accurate on that. Though, of course, reading the story, there's an absence of any strong female characters in it. For the most part, they are kind of hidden in the shadows, or even if one argues that Elizabeth has this inner strength to take care of her family and to, in light of the mother's death, Beth is there to hold her ground and to take care of everybody, to love Victor in spite of his wanderings and his work, which she really doesn't know all that much about. You do have a hidden form of a stronger woman in the background, but they are, in this case, really kept very much in the background. Their strength is in taking care of others, and being able to hold themselves and their families and their partners or their soulmates close to them. Elizabeth does that, though, of course, she doesn't really get the satisfaction of having love reciprocated to her the way that one would wish that she had. So is Percy doing Mary that favor and creating a potential for that? I think so, and I do think his love for Mary was quite genuine, in spite of the fact that he had multiple women going at any time with her, including with her sister. Something that he was very upfront about. Again, let's be really clear. Mary knew what she was getting into when she, was throwing herself towards him and with him when they would gather, even at her mother's grave, when they would travel and she would run away from home. She knew the type of man he was, and it wasn't that he just had a very high libido. This was a man in search of the perfect sort of woman who was, for lack of another term, she was androgynous. And his history of women shows that he either wanted women he could form or women who would ultimately satisfy what his need was for a very strong woman.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Now, I would like to direct listeners to a conversation I had with Tom Secker about this topic of Frankenstein's authorship, and we actually talk about Mary Wollstonecraft and all that too. So I'll put that in the show notes of this interview. As regarding Shelley Unbound, are there any points about the book or any just whatever about the book that you'd like listeners to know about, Dr. de Hart?
Well, first, for those who have not read it, I would like them to read it from the standpoint of knowing this is not an attack on Mary Shelley in the slightest. In fact, I think I do the best job possible to show that by moving the credit back to Percy Shelley, it is not a discredit to Mary. It is, in fact, the book tries to portray it as an act of love and an act of trust which she kept for him. So there's nothing in the story or in my book that will move one to take a negative opinion of Mary. Nor is there anything in my book which is trying to direct people away from the idea that I'm attacking feminism. The book really has nothing to do with that, nor is it written as a political manifesto. My intention is simply to say, if we look at the facts of the story, its history, the history as given by the 1818 preface author, and the story's background given by the 1831 author, which is clearly Mary Shelley in 1831, unless Percy was writing from the grave, we can see that the story has some background to it which is generally missed and ignored. I'm trying to address that, to put this context, a better frame of mind, to see that there is an agenda in Frankenstein. The agenda deals specifically with Illuminati. It deals with alchemy. It deals with the questions of soulmates, love, and of searching after the love that one doesn't have, which is tied obviously into an androgynous idea that Percy has set forward. And if anything, the book is meant to provoke a reader to read Frankenstein again, and with a new mind and eye as to what is really going on behind the story, and with a simple pulling back of the curtain to show another author, namely Percy, it becomes an entirely different story, and I think a beautiful story, not a disappointing horror story, which is not, as I said, in any ways terrifying or horrific. It is, anybody who reads it must be quite bewildered at the fact that it's ever labeled in the genre of horror other than the 1931 movie.
Yeah, definitely. Now, the website for the book is shelleyunbound.com. Could you tell us about the website and just how to get a hold of the book itself?
The book should be, the book is available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and any other place that sells books, I imagine. It is also in, at this point, it's starting to make it to the shelves at Barnes & Noble, and from contacts I've had at Barnes & Noble, it's gradually being brought into their stores. If it's not, they can certainly order it, but they are one of the ones that is carrying it. My website, ShelleyUnbound.com, is designed in a way to present new material. I've got a blog on it where I will add my own thoughts about various subjects related to poetry, alchemy, Illuminati, atheism, and really just to kind of keep readers engaged in the subjects that I think are quite relevant today, because though Frankenstein is a novel that is now almost 200 years old, its themes are very important today, and the transhumanism theme is one we really have to take quite seriously. The idea that there are people in our world who have an agenda and who would try to slide it in is also something we need to be aware of. And Frankenstein clearly makes that point. And the background of Percy is designed, I think, to really help people have a place to participate and see what is going on behind the scenes, and how literature is a great part of both presenting the agenda as well as hiding it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. This topic, I can't get enough of it, and I want to say that I have read the book and I thoroughly enjoy it, and I definitely want to thank you, Dr. de Hart, for coming on this show to do the interview.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I was looking forward to doing it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Trans Resistor Radio. I do hope that listeners will check out Dr. de Hart's website, ShelleyUnbound.com, and of course his book, Shelley Unbound. If you want to get a hold of that book, there will be a link in the show notes at theageoftransitions.com. Thank you once again. Keep listening. More great episodes are in the pipeline here at Trans Resistor Radio.